again, welcome back to CIMM Sessions, our little bite-sized servings of theology, culture, and community of Christ, identity, mission, message, and beliefs and practices. I'm David Lloyd, the director of CIMM, the Center for Innovation in Ministry and Mission, through the Graceland and Community of Christ Seminary. It's another cold night here in the Midwest, and so I'm still at home. So I hope to be back in the temple next week to lead CIMM sessions, but here we are once again, and we're glad that so many of you are able to make it in this evening and share with us as Barbara Walden, who is the executive director of the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, is going to share with us. Recently, she wrote a wonderful little story in the Herald that I wanted her to elaborate on a little bit more tonight, called Light and Loss. And I think it really is one of those healing readings. If you get a chance to go back a few months and read that article, that puts us in a place of the transition that we're all going through in regard to our historic sites and our mission as a church. So Barbara is joining us from Kirtland, Ohio, in the Sidney Rigdon home, and we're glad that you could join us. So go ahead and share with us, Barbara.
Thank you, David. It is an honor to share with you this evening, and I hope everybody joining us is having a good evening as well. As David mentioned, I'm sharing tonight from the historic Sidney Rigdon home, and fun fact, today also happens to be Sidney Rigdon's birthday. He was born on February 19th, 1793 in St. Clair, Pennsylvania, 232 years ago. So I wish I could distract you with all sorts of fun church history facts tonight, but David has asked me to speak more fully about the article that I wrote for the Herald. And as David mentioned, I serve as the director of the Historic Sites Foundation, and sharing church history feels like, well, it feels natural to me. It feels like a calling for me. Whether it's shared in a one-on-one conversation or in an online lecture or at a history conference. But tonight, he's asked me to speak about my own story, my own journey over the last year. And honestly, that is a much tougher assignment. And I'll confess, this assignment makes me very uncomfortable. I'm glad that I'm here, but having the spotlight on myself versus someone from church history is just out of my comfort zone. I really prefer to talk about the stories of the people from our past. It's easy for us historians to deflect attention off yourself onto someone else from years ago. That's my comfort zone. However, we at the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation like to remind people that your story is church history. So tonight, I've got to buckle down and practice what I preach. So it's a humbling experience. And I ask that you please have a little grace for me as I step out of that comfort zone and share with you a story that I've been writing through life experiences and relationships for a little over a year now. And there might be a little bit of crying as well. So for as long as I can remember, I've wanted to see the Northern Lights, also called the Aurora Borealis. And I mentioned this in the article. I've traveled all the way to Alaska a little over a decade ago, thinking this was my chance to see the Northern Lights. And I caught the most breathtakingly cloudy sky I'd ever hoped for. I didn't hope for it at all, but that's what I got. Then I was up in northern Michigan at the Park of the Pines Reunion, a glorious campground where generations of campers have told tales of seeing the night sky light up as the northern lights stretched across the sky like rainbow frosting on a birthday cake. But all I saw was the twinkling stars across a blacker than black night sky when I was there at Park of the Pines. So then in the summer of 2023, I went to Camp Winneaguamuck, our church campground all the way up in Maine, and forecasters were predicting these glorious northern lights would reveal themselves midweek during that reunion. You know what I saw that night? The most glorious fog of all my life. So you can imagine with these three strikes against me, these three failed chances, you can imagine my excitement in May of 2024 when forecasters and news reporters began saying that the northern lights would make a rare appearance across the northern Regency of the United States and then would dip as far south as Indiana. So here was old Sister Walden's chance to see her northern lights. They said the best time would be between the hours of midnight and 2 a.m. Well, with enough Mountain Dew coursing through my system, I stayed up those late hours to see the lights. At midnight, I walked out to the back porch and looked up, and I saw nothing. I waited, but no new colors appeared. I went in and out of the house. It seemed like every 15 minutes, hoping to catch those colors, but nothing. All over social media, I saw these breathtaking photos of the northern lights in Michigan and in Ohio and in Maine. But in my own backyard, the sky looked like the same old sky. Then about 1:45 a.m., I saw a news headline suggesting that if you were having trouble seeing the lights, one should look at the sky through the camera lens of their smartphone. Well, I had all but given up at this point, to be honest, but I figured, what do I have to lose? I'm up at 1:45, pumped with Mountain Dew. I might as well go check it out. So I sailed out on the back porch once again, held up my phone, waiting for my final disappointment of the night. So imagine my surprise when I saw the sky light up in beautiful pinks and greens and blues. It brought tears to my eyes. It was so glorious, so amazing, and so much more than I'd ever anticipated. The northern lights were there all along. I just couldn't see them. I didn't have the right tools or lens to see that they were there, painted across the night sky all along. And I'm going to do a screen share to show you what I saw that night. I shared in the article that I felt like I had been living this Northern Lights experience in my own personal and spiritual life. In the midst of incredible loss, my eyes and heart had been opened to the love of our Creator, a love that is all around me, all over the world. I just didn't have the right lens to fully experience it. I still believe that very much today. The article spoke specifically about brokenness and loss as it related to my journey with the March 5th announcement, and I promised to talk about that in more detail this evening. The article, however, didn't mention that I learned the news about the stewardship transfer of the historic sites 2 days after my marriage of 22 years had come to an end. I had been on my own journey of loss and light in the months leading up to the church announcement about the historic sites. I was in a different place emotionally and mentally when the news hit me. I was in a different place than I had expected to be, different one that I had planned to be in, but one that understood the importance of faith and the expansiveness of love in this world because I had experienced it. And let me explain. After years of counseling, it was clear to my husband Jody and I that our marriage wasn't working. I'll save you the details of what led to the divorce and simply share that despite the love we had for one another, we had grown apart and had no longer valued the same things. We made this divorce decision together, but that didn't make it an easy decision. He was my best friend, and we had nearly 25 years of history together. I couldn't imagine a future without him. And yet I learned that you can hold two truths simultaneously. On one hand, I was devastated that my marriage was coming to an end. And on the other hand, I knew this was the right decision. I knew this was the right thing to do. And in the months that followed the decision, I struggled with how I was going to break the news to our family and our friends. I carried a sense of shame for months and a fear of disappointing the people in my life. I felt like an absolute failure, and those feelings began to take a toll on my overall worth and self-confidence. You know, I have family members and friends who have experienced divorce, and I never looked at them through a lens of shame or failure. But the judgment that I placed on myself when I was in that position was a heavy load. I did feel shame. I did feel like a failure. And I feared what the response of my loved ones would be. Well, fortunately, when I finally broke down and quit carrying the secret, when I finally shared the news with my family, my fears did not come to fruition. I found compassion and love. As the decision settled in, I began reaching out to friends who had also gone through a divorce, asking to hear their stories. And hearing their stories was a remarkable ministry to me. At a time when I felt scared and alone, hearing their stories of overcoming dark periods in their life gave me hope. I then began to reach out to others, some who were just acquaintances and others who I had only met in passing, inviting them, asking them to sit and share their stories with me, saying, hey, we don't know each other all that well, but would you be willing to tell me about one of the darkest periods of your life? I was surprised that not a single person said no when I asked them to sit with me. People shared their stories in long phone calls, in Zoom chats. They shared their stories over coffee at Panera's and more. Their willingness to be vulnerable and honest about their own personal journey was an incredible blessing in my life. Sharing about darker valleys in life can be terrifying, and it takes a lot of courage to share with someone you don't know very well. It takes a lot of courage to share with someone you do know very well. But what grew out of those experiences, what grew out of those stories with all of the emotions and the tears was a deep connection. It was an understanding that you were not alone, that we were here to support one another. During my darkest hour, I experienced sacred community through the power and gift of story. And those friends, those strangers, those acquaintances who trusted in me with their stories of loss and light created a village that surrounded me in my time of need. The vast majority of those who shared their stories with me were members of our faith community, were members of Community of Christ. It was this faith community that made up the core of that little village of sacred community that surrounded me in my time of need. I learned that when we have courage to be honest and vulnerable with one another, to say, I'm not okay, it opens up a connection of grace and compassion between humans where the Holy Spirit is very much present. In those stories and those connections, I felt the Holy Spirit guiding and strengthening me. As I heard the stories, I felt the Holy Spirit within those stories. So where I had invested my heart, my hopes and my dreams into a single individual, and the realization that the 50th golden anniversary mark would not happen, that was devastating. But the path that followed, the connections made, the stories shared, helped me see that I was surrounded by love. It was in my brokenness that, like the Northern Lights, that I began to see God's love surrounding me in and through this dark period of my life. So when Lachlan Mackay arrived in my driveway 2 days after a judge in Marion County, Indiana, shared the divorce decree, I was in a space where I was finally beginning to rebuild after so much of my personal life, it felt, had burned down around me. As you can imagine, news of the World Church Leadership's Council decision to transfer ownership was difficult to hear for our faith community. For me personally, the news was devastating. For over 2 decades, I've been privileged to serve at the historic sites, sharing the stories and lessons of our spiritual ancestors who built, lived, and later cared for these historic places. Much of who I am today is shaped by the years spent in Kirtland and Nauvoo, in roles from summer intern to site director. When I visit the Kirtland Temple, I see Emma Smith's story just as much as I see my own history shared in that historic house of worship. My heart ached over this decision, but it also hit differently than I had ever imagined. These are some photos of interning in Nauvoo in the summer of 1996. We have the Alma Blair internship program for young adults involved in church history. And during this time and through decades, you had young adults serving as interns. This is where my experience with church history and the historic sites began. I was right out of my freshman year at Graceland University, and I was looking to get out on my own when an opportunity to intern in Nauvoo came up. The choice was I can either go home to Southern California or I could live a Mark Twain life out on the Mississippi all on my own without the watchful eye of my brother or my parents looking over me. So I jumped on that opportunity. I didn't have a passion for history. I had no interest in history. It was that independent life on the Mississippi River that was calling me to Nauvoo. But what happened was an absolute formational experience, taking classes with Alma Blair and learning a side of church history that was beyond fascinating. He opened my eyes to an honest and accurate narrative of our faith community's story. It was one that was intriguing. It was one that was challenging. It was one not like the story that my grandmother shared with me. And so that was both a challenging and difficult summer, reinterpreting or re-understanding the story of our faith community. But it was also a summer that was formational when it came to identity. It was the first time in my life that I was answering questions about Community of Christ faith and beliefs and identity. And by the end of that summer, I was proud of Community of Christ, which at the time was proud of the RLDS Church. I went home after that Nauvoo experience with my RLDS keychain and an acknowledgement that I would never make it as an 1840s pioneer. I think one summer in the summer kitchen, churning butter and spinning wool, taught me that I'd never make it. I'm very much happy in our period in time. Well, during this period, if you survived a summer in Nauvoo and they thought you did well enough, you had the opportunity to apply for an internship in Kirtland. And this was the summer of 1997, my first summer in Kirtland. And after learning the intriguing side of church history in Nauvoo, to come to Kirtland, history came alive. To give tours in the Kirtland Temple really opened up my mind to the power that is within our stories, the power that is within church history. As you're telling the story of the 1830s church members who built and worshipped in the Kirtland Temple, in the evenings, we would also have youth caravans and congregational retreats coming through Kirtland, worshiping in the temple. So as you're talking about and reading stories about the Spirit impacting people of the 1830s, with groups that were traveling through, you could feel that same Spirit in the lower court impacting and changing lives in our time and day. And for a 19-year-old undergrad, this was an incredible experience. I remember by the end of the summer telling Lachlan Mackay, who was the director of the Kirtland Temple at the time, how I wanted his job. Like one day, my dream job would be director of the Kirtland Temple. That just seemed like the most exciting place for a history nerd. Well, after graduate school, by 2002, Lachlan had become the director of all of the Community of Christ historic sites, and an opening was made available for the site director. And fortunately, the church saw me as credible enough to have that position. And it was such an honor to serve in that position as the site director. As you can see, I look like I was about 14 years old. But boy, was it an amazing opportunity. This is a photo in the old visitor center, and I served from 2002 to 2009, and it was a period that changed my life. It was a time when we built a new visitor center, we hosted conferences, just an incredible time. So a long history in this space. It's where we had our first Emma Smith Hymn Festival, celebrating our 200th anniversary in 2004, and where we welcomed World Service Corps volunteers from all over the world. It was definitely an impactful time in my life, but also witnessing the impact of our heritage and the impact of the power of this place in other lives was profound for me. So for as long as I could remember, I felt like I had three anchors in my life: my faith, my marriage, and a sense of calling. For me, my work with the Historic Sites Foundation feels like a calling, and one that I'm really passionate about. I truly believe that there are lessons embedded in our shared history that can change our lives if we only listen. My divorce had clipped one of the three anchors. When Locke broke the news to me, a second anchor was clipped, and I wasn't sure what the future looked like. The American communal group, known as the Shakers, founded by a woman named Ann Lee, have a saying, and that saying is hands to work, hearts to God. Perhaps subconsciously, I took that motto to heart as I traveled to Nauvoo and Kirtland last spring after hearing the news I traveled to those places to help the site staff in this difficult transition. While my heart turned to God, my feet turned to walking the historic grounds, and my hands were used to wrap David Hiram Smith paintings, to pack precious documents and rare books from the site libraries and archives. I was there to help carefully box up artifacts in preparation for their long journey to the Community of Christ archives. Friends, these were dark times for those of us at the historic sites. There were more questions than answers. The shock of the news and that personal loss that followed could not be measured. We didn't know what the future would look like. At times, we weren't sure what we would look like. Who will we be without these historic structures and the opportunity to share these stories with people all over the world? Part of me wondered, will I still have a job after all of this is over? Will anyone ever want to support church history ever again? Am I going to end up living in my parents' basement? There were a flood of questions during this time of uncertainty. It was a great period. It was a time of brokenness and definitely uncertainty. An unsettled feeling that I can't put into words, that I can't accurately describe. In the midst of this grief and this loss, while helping the site staff organize and pack pieces of our church heritage, our little group of volunteers and staff in Nauvoo soon discovered that we had the love and support of one another. We gathered around the table to share in meals, wonderfully delicious meals that were cooked for us with loving hands. We broke down in tears together. We shared in our disappointments and our anger. We took ice cream breaks. We occasionally laughed together and shared memories of better times in Nauvoo. In the midst of our grief and our brokenness, we discovered sacred community. There was depth in our connectedness once we shed our masks and had the courage to be vulnerable with one another and revealed our brokenness to each other, whether it was over the dinner table or on a walk along the river. We witnessed each other's despair and were not afraid to confess that we didn't know what the future would look like either. Like the Northern Lights that appeared through the lens of a camera, I experienced sacred community with people who I had known for years, but had not connected with on such a raw, emotional, and vulnerable level. Which takes me to Doctrine and Covenants. Section 161, 3b, and it reads, "Do not be fearful of one another. Respect each life journey, even in its brokenness and uncertainty, for each person has walked alone at times. Be ready to listen and slow to criticize, lest judgments be unrighteous and unredemptive." We listened to one another's cries and anxieties along that Mississippi River as we packed the historic items and said goodbye to the historic grounds, the grounds that helped shape and mold who we are today. We recognize that none of us would have made it through this time of grief if we didn't have the strength and support of one another. The light that led us out of this loss was that sacred community created there in Nauvoo. And as I stood there in Nauvoo on a starlit evening in February, taking in the glistening lights over Emma Smith's historic homes, I took comfort knowing this wasn't the first time our faith community experienced uncertainty and despair along the banks of the Mississippi. We had the benefit of knowing the people of the past found the faith and courage to continue their story, and there was a glimmer of hope in knowing that our generation would do the same. Friends, loss is nothing new to us. Our faith community was born out of brokenness. A teenage boy in Western New York didn't go skipping into a grove of trees singing the theme song of Sound of Music. He walked into that sacred grove overwhelmed with shame, and he was seeking repentance. It was a dark period in his life where he had more questions than answers, and he knelt down in a spirit of desperation and brokenness. It was in that spirit of isolation that he encountered God. That experience continues to teach us today that it's okay to admit when we're not okay. It's safe to ask questions. And no matter where you are in your own journey, God is listening with an enduring love that surpasses our own fears and anxieties about the future. It was Also in a time of brokenness and despair, when Jason Briggs, founder of the reorganization, knelt down in prayer near his home in southern Wisconsin. Jason cried out to God for guidance during a dark time in his life and received a message that offered him the peace and comfort and direction that he was seeking. His experience of both loss and light resonated for faithful dissenters across the Midwest, who soon joined together, giving our faith community a second chance to get it right. Which then takes us to Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenants, section 161, 3C. Be patient with one another, for creating sacred community is arduous and even painful, but it is to loving community such as this that each is called. Be courageous and visionary, believing in the power of just a few vibrant witnesses to transform the world. Be assured that love will overcome the voices of fear, division, and deceit. Well, after my time in Nauvoo, I headed to the Kirtland Temple, where I was when the March 5th announcement was made. I was in Kirtland when the public announcement was made. To say that our local congregation was upset following the news is an understatement. The community was reeling, and the pastoral team, shocked and stunned themselves, knew if they didn't gather the congregation quickly to process the news, the end result would be unrepairable damage to our beloved community in Northeast Ohio. So soon a group of about 25 to 30 people gathered into the Chestnut Room, a wood-paneled classroom at the congregation. Folding chairs set in a large circle provided that opportunity for us to see and hear one another. And as I looked around the room, I saw hearts breaking. I saw inconsolable tears flowing. I saw anger and disappointment and shock. The tone of the voices in the room ran a wide spectrum, from a soft whisper while choking back tears to passionate shouts from furious speakers, many of whom directed their words to the Community of Christ apostle that was there in our midst. As they spoke to Locke, through their tears, he listened intently and cried along with them. He shared in their pain as a former member of the congregation. And when they finished speaking, he thanked them by name and told them he loved them. As I sat there amid all the pain and suffering, I realized that underneath it all was love. These individuals would not have shown up that evening if they didn't care. This back room was a safe place to process their loss and despair together. Together, they were desperately seeking some light to this emotional and spiritual darkness that they were feeling. When the meeting was adjourned, instead of seeing people storm out, I witnessed those who were earlier pointing and yelling at one another embrace and warm hugs and compassion. They stayed for fellowship. They stayed to hear about the grandkids and bring each other up to speed about what was going on in their lives. In my own grief, I realized this is the church. The opening up of our hearts in times of joy, but also brokenness and despair, to support one another, even when we don't have the answers. This is Community of Christ and the sacred community I witnessed that night. And like the Northern Lights, it had been there all along. It was in the midst of shared heartache and tears with my brothers and sisters in Kirtland that I was able to see the sacredness of community much more clearly. In our brokenness, we are able to connect on a deeper level. We are able to share our stories and help one another towards healing. That's what I've learned over the past year, and it is what Christ calls us to do. It has been in our faith community story from the very beginning. Doctrine and Covenants section 162 reminds us, do not be discouraged. You have not been promised an easy path, but you have been assured that the Spirit that calls you will also accompany you. You are a good and faithful people, but sometimes you fail to see the power that is resident in your own story and fellowship. Look carefully, listen attentively, and sense the Spirit among you. You know, as a student of history over the last 2+ decades, I have read about the struggles and the sacrifices of generations of church members before us. I've read about their struggles, read about what they sacrificed, and I saw how they were able to get through it. I guess in the back of my head, I thought our generation wouldn't have to endure or undergo those sacrifices, those challenges. And I think in the experience of the March 5th announcement and the grief that came through that, it was recognizing that indeed our generation is being asked to make the sacrifices and challenges similar to what early generations of church members have had to do. So as the days and the weeks and months pass, my grief is slowly transforming into gratitude. Gratitude for those who have gone before us, paving a path of faith and resilience that has changed an untold number of lives, including my own. I feel a gratitude for the incredible blessing Community of Christ had as a faithful, hardworking steward of these historic places for well over a century. Gratitude for the opportunities to share the sacred story with generations of people from all over the world. And what an incredible experience, what an incredible honor it has been to care for these historic structures and to preserve the legacy of those who came before us. People like Catherine Cassie Kelly, who saved the Kirtland Temple in the 1880s when she rushed into action several times when the temple caught on fire, even rounding up a bucket brigade to put out a fire on the historic bell tower. Our little faith community, I'm telling you, friends, has saved these historic structures time and time again for untold decades. So as we transferred the historic properties, we did so with pride. We do knowing we have served these historic places well and have done all we could to preserve and maintain the properties to the best of our faith community's ability. And let me clarify, when I say we transferred the historic sites, we did it with pride. There was a lot of pain there. There was a lot of suffering there. And I feel that. But it's also the sense of knowing that we did everything we could to preserve and maintain these places the way that they deserve to be maintained for past generations and for future generations. That gives me a sense of pride that our faith community, our little faith community, was able to do what we have done for well over a decade. Doctrine and Covenants, section 162, 2a reads, "Listen carefully to your own journey as a people, for it is a sacred journey, and it has taught you many things you must know for the journey yet to come. Listen to its teachings and discover anew its principles. Do not yearn for times that are past, but recognize that you have been given a foundation of faithful service, even as you build a foundation for what is yet to be." Our faith community's history has shown us that we are a resilient people. It has shown us that challenges often birth our greatest traditions, and that adversity strengthens our resolve to move forward. My time in Kirtland last spring reminded me that the early saints who sacrificed so much to build the Kirtland Temple are also the same saints who left the temple behind in 1838 and 1839. I imagine many of the feelings the temple builders must have felt as they departed Kirtland over 185 years ago were not far from the emotional pain many of us are feeling today. Doctrine and Covenants 162.8c reminds us, "Continue your journey, O people of the restoration. You have been blessed thus far, but there is so much yet to see, so much yet to do. Go forth with confidence and live prophetically as a people who have been loved and who now courageously choose to love others in the name of the one you serve." Amen. Our history has shown that, I mentioned that we are a resilient people, and that our history can birth, our struggles and our challenges can birth some of our greatest traditions. But friends, I'm here to tell you that church history didn't die with that March 5th announcement. The Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation and the Church History and Sacred Story team will continue this tradition of resilience, not only in raising awareness of our heritage, but in expanding our educational programs and outreach. The Alma Blair internship program will live on, impacting the lives of young adults as they serve in new locations, as they serve as in the Community of Christ archives, at Joseph Smith III's Liberty Hall in Lamoni, and working with the Oral History program each summer. We will continue to host historians and scholars as they share their latest research in our winter book series and our free online lectures throughout the year. Our bus tours, whether in the US or abroad, will continue to offer guest opportunity to experience the significant places where history happened, and new opportunities to preserve and share church heritage will include and will continue to expand in efforts to record oral histories, to document church histories across the globe, and broadening our understandings of the past through new online educational programs, and feature articles in every edition of the Herald moving forward. These initiatives have come with support from Community of Christ. And so as I share with you tonight from the historic Sidney Rigdon home in Kirtland, Ohio, I'm also right next door to the Kirtland Community of Christ congregation, a congregation that is experiencing a rebirth of their own heritage of hospitality and storytelling. This congregation is opening its doors to host classes and walking tours for congregational retreats and youth caravans. They're talking about hosting women's retreats that focus on sharing the stories of women in Kirtland history. They have an awesome industrial-sized kitchen with a dining room and an auditorium that can host well over 100 guests. I think they had over 200 with the Kirtland Kiwanis Christmas dinner. This congregation gives me hope. They give me hope that Community of Christ's long history will continue to be shared in Kirtland through walking tours, through weekend classes, through storyteller nights, and more. Our 194-year-old story is about a continuing journey with Christ that is unfolding within all of us. Our faith community is not a museum, but a community of seekers and dissenters learning to listen to the Spirit breathe and learning to love one another even in our brokenness. Our church heritage is not restricted to any one place or structure, and our ability to share the stories and lessons from our uniquely inspiring past does not depend on site ownership. So in the midst of the grief we have all shared over this past year, I find comfort and hope in knowing that we will continue to lift up the lessons from our Kirtland and Nauvoo history in new and expansive ways. I recognize this year has been a painful one, but church history shows us that painful stories of shared suffering also give birth to deeper community connections and a stronger understanding of identity and purpose. Our shared heritage not only connects us to the past, it turns us to the future as a community of hope. It shines a light on our own efforts in contributing to a common goal that expands a world outside of ourselves. And what we have experienced collectively over the past year also challenges us to move into the future with a new sense of purpose and calling. For me personally, I have never felt a stronger calling to this task than I do now in this historic moment. It is rare for a community that has invested decades preserving and interpreting the past to suddenly be placed in a position of experiencing church history in the now, of living church history. We are living in a time that future Community of Christ members and historians will look back on and mine valuable lessons from our actions and decisions in this day and time. So this past year has forced us to wonder, what kind of ancestor will you be? What kind of ancestor will I be? I refuse to believe we will be the ancestors that give up and walk away from the past. Rather, I believe that like those who have gone before us, now is the time when we show our strength and resilience. That now is the time when we double down on sharing church heritage and establishing new programs that highlight the lessons embedded in the past. It is our day and time to expand opportunities to young adults to experience church history, to spotlight the artifact treasures in the Community of Christ Museum collection, to expand our engaging online lectures to include more hands-on history opportunities, and explore offering summer classes led by gifted and experienced historians. a time for more church history to be integrated in today's community of Christ, not less. Future opportunities, like the ones being offered in Kirtland, give me hope and enthusiasm for the future. Community of Christ history is essential to who we are as a faith community, not just because we have a great story to tell, and we do love a great story, but because our history prepares us and emboldens us for the journey ahead. The words of Doctrine and Covenants, section 162, I think captures Community of Christ's continuing journey, especially the part of the story that we are actively writing and experiencing today. Those words read, "The spirit of the restoration is not locked in one moment of time, but is instead the call to every generation to witness to essential truths in its own language and form. Let the Spirit breathe." So long story short, I think that through our brokenness and loss, we hear the Holy Spirit with more clarity and with more volume. That has certainly been my experience. It's certainly been my experience in my life. The light that I have experienced throughout this loss is an immense amount of love within this faith community and a hope, the same hope and resilience that is embedded in our past, a hope reliant on our faith in God, and that hope is now sending us long into the future. Thank you.
Barbara, I don't know you that well, but in the short time that after I read your article and sought you out and had a few conversations with you, golly, some people are put into terrible situations, but for all the right reasons. And this was a masterful sharing in a short order. By the way, those of you who have been here for a while, going through the preaching series, this was a good example of what would have been a good sermon. Okay, the idea of the whole concept of looking for the aurora borealis, and sometimes we have to go through different lenses in order to discover it, and that being honest about this has been difficult for so many. And I want to first of all acknowledge everyone's feelings who might be a part of this or watching this recorded. Some of us are still in pain over this. Some of us were happy that it took place when it happened. We've had a whole variety of emotions surrounding something that is tangible in our story. And how that's affected us. Barbara and I were sharing. She is actually in my wife's bedroom. They're in the Sidney Rigdon house from my wife's senior year of high school, and so we were talking about that space right there that she's in. But many of us have experienced this not just with historic sites, but have experienced it with campgrounds and congregations and other places that have had a loss of space, and tried to, as we go through that experience, to find our place in that, and how do we make sense of the world around us when something that we may have taken for granted is no longer there. But what a wonderful way you have presented that tonight, Barbara. And I was looking through most of the questions on our chats are wonderfully uplifting and hopeful amidst our grief. Thank you for uplifting message, a message of restorative blessing of community. Thank you for sharing this message. Lots of people who can relate, and for the place that you have been in, I'm sure you never dreamed when you went into this position that it would turn out the way it did. And yet you're wrestling through that. I can hear through your emotional words has been so helpful to come back to those recent revelatory words to our church and find a way through that. So I guess I will go to one of my questions. You know, as many of us have struggled with the loss of these places in our life, How have you been able to turn that into something that motivates you to still stay connected to that story?
That's a great question. Uh, um, oh, that is a good question.
Mm,
And I think when I think of my connection to the Kirtland Temple, for example,
hmm.
when I served as intern and site director, one of my favorite things to do was to sneak inside the lower court and when I had it all to myself. After a tour was over and, I wished everyone a good day and closed those big wooden doors, I'd run into the lower court and I'd have that space to myself in
Yeah.
prayer and meditation. Sometimes I'd play the piano.
There's nothing like them. I can attest. That is a great experience to share alone in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a communion with God, and it's a communion where generations before you have sat and communed with God. It's where I would take some of the toughest questions that I was struggling with. It was a place that I knew I would encounter God there. And so the night before the announcement was made, as I was sitting in the lower court, thinking about, I'm not going to have that space anymore, and wanting to, like a mental photograph of every inch of that space as I climbed the stairs and I thought about what I was losing, I was also realizing that God is not contained in one building, in one structure, and that I needed to expand God's location. I needed to start seeing God outside of that place in my time of need, to where I would flee to the Kirtland Temple. When I had those difficult questions now, I was being challenged to find God in other places, to find that sanctuary that I had found for so many years in Kirtland. And that challenge, I think, has propelled me. Now, when it comes to the passion for the historic sites and why didn't I just close the door to the Kirtland Temple and walk away and be done with the historic sites? Honestly, that never occurred to me because I think that our history is much more than the historic structures that we're preserving. Don't get me wrong, I believe there's importance in those historic structures. I believe there is power in place. I believe that there is
Yeah.
lessons embedded in our artifacts. I mean, I'm a curator at heart, and history is always going to be important to me, but it's not limited to just Kirtland and Nauvoo. And I think the sale of these sites, as much as it broke my heart, it also propelled us into the future. And now we need to focus on other areas of our history that is equally hopeful, equally challenging, equally insightful. This gives us an opportunity to take a look at the reorganization, take a look at 20th century history, and what were some of the difficult challenges we were facing in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. This gives us that opportunity where I think before we were really, really focused our minds and our resources on Kirtland and Nauvoo alone. And now we're being asked to expand out of that. As heartbreaking as it is to see those sites transferred to another entity, I also feel hopeful that we will be able to find even more inspiration and empowerment through our church history. Like I said, church history isn't contained in one or two historic structures. We can share it all over the world because church history is all over the world.
Yeah, and I think part of this is also comforting, and somebody just brought it up in the chats. I'm comforted knowing the sites are still there, and the new owners will lovingly maintain them with the resources that Community of Christ would likely never have had to muster. It is a it is a trade-off in emotions on that, and yet we do remind ourselves that the mission of Jesus Christ goes beyond the tangible. Now, I still, we all know that when we have been at a place where we have had a significant spiritual experience, it becomes something more to us in that place, and yet we still feel the the push of the Spirit to recognize that it's going from that place that's more important than being in that place. And I think that's maybe where our history can take us, because it informs us of where we've been. I mean, and honestly, the Kirtland Temple has been in our hands much longer than it was in the early church's hands, but before we left Kirtland. We've got all this over 100 years of history of how we have taken care of that building, what it's meant to us, times where we almost sold it before, and all these things. But it comes back to the idea of, well, as we have experienced this history, where does it take us? And I think that's something that I think would be good for us to explore. Now, for you, as the Historic Sites Foundation leader, where do we go now? What are our options? What is the Historic Sites providing the church in regard to, this is a good time to plug, regarding what you do and what the Historic Sites Foundation does?
Well, that's a great question. And I always enjoy when people invite me to talk about the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. This is an interesting time for us. So much of what we were doing in raising funds went to preserving and maintaining the historic sites, but specifically to the Kirtland and Nauvoo sites. And a lot of the resources went to providing funds for the interns in Kirtland and Nauvoo. Well, with those sites now no longer being maintained by Community of Christ, and that number of interns no longer having an opportunity to work at those historic sites, it pushes us out of the box to think more creatively about, well, how can we now give young adults that church history experience without giving tours of the Kirtland Temple and giving tours in Nauvoo? And so out of that, having interns at the church archives, just last summer, as the collections from Kirtland and Nauvoo were going to Independence, this was a great opportunity for two young adults serving as interns to process that collection and to see history that most interns would never have the opportunity to see. They did videos talking about seeing the enduring principles through church history. They created an exhibit. It's just continuing to expand. Having an intern at Liberty Hall in Lamoni, she was able to do a number of things. There was an archaeological dig that was going on. There were community events that were happening. It was a new way to learn church history, but in a way that's engaging for the community through community outreach. And that intern continued long after the summer was over. So that's exciting to see. It's exciting to see that the oral history program that is managed by Megan Edvelson is now advertising an opportunity for a summer intern to work with her in recording church history and hearing it from the people who actually lived church history. And I think that's exciting that we're growing the oral history records in the church archives. We're better preserving the past. So for us at the Historic Sites Foundation, we're expanding our opportunities in ways that we never had the opportunity to do. Because we were so focused on wanting to keep those sites open and funded, we weren't able to expand in educational ways that we can now do. We're now exploring we're talking about expanding our online lectures. So this summer, we're going to have a new series called Hands-on History, where the archivist of the church, Rachel Killebrew, is going to spend a night talking about what it is to manage the archives. And she'll talk about what it is to be a local historian in your congregation and mission center and how you can preserve the past where you are. We're going to have Megan Edvelson talking about how she does oral histories and how you can record an oral history of someone significant in your congregation or mission center, to where people can see that when it comes to preserving the past, you don't have to have a PhD. You just have to have a love of history and a few skills along the way. We have a woman named Karen Norton who's going to talk about preserving the past in England and the British Isles Mission Center.
So your online lectures and sort, where can people get information on signing up for that?
Well, they go to historicsitesfoundation.org. That's where we advertise for the online lectures. That's where they'll see information soon enough as we get closer to the summer about the summer book series. But if they were to go onto the Foundation's page now, they would see that we're starting a winter book series this Thursday, starting it tomorrow, where we have 3 books that we're going to explore every Thursday over the next 3 weeks. Tomorrow night, we're talking about Catherine Smith Salisbury with Kyle Walker, the author of the new biography. But we're just looking at new ways to share and preserve church heritage. We're looking at highlighting artifacts from the church history collection that we didn't have the time and resources to do before. We're looking at better preserving Heritage Plaza, the Plano Stone Church, and Liberty Hall. It's just new opportunities. Still doing the annual bus tour, and this October we're gonna.
And we've had someone lift up the bus tour as being a wonderful experience.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Mark your calendars for October 6th through the 15th. We're going to have a tour called Drawn from the Nations of the World, and it's going to look at church history through the lens of folks who, church history through all around the world. So we're going to travel up to Council Bluffs and take a look at English immigrants and their story. We'll look at Italian immigrants and how they contributed to church history. Hear the story of John Avendet. We'll travel over to Mission and Plano Stone Church and hear about Norwegian immigrants and how they impacted the church. When we're in Kirtland, we'll talk about French Polynesians and their influence on the early saints in Kirtland.
And that's one area that we really need to focus on. Is it's more than American church history. It is a broad and diverse church history. A couple of other real quick before we close out here. Any plans to make more use of the Stone Church in Plano?
Well, we're looking at preserving it better. We're working with Mission Center President Blake Smith on how it could be better utilized. The congregation, from what I understand, is no longer meeting in the Plano Stone Church, but we're looking at new ways that the Stone Church can be used. Yeah, so we're looking at how those buildings can be better used. Thinking creatively of a new era.
And someone asks, do you envision the museum and the temple reopening?
Oh, that's a good
question. Yeah.
That is not something that we oversee at the historic. I hope so. I know that a number of the items from Kirtland and Nauvoo are now on display in the museum, but that's a good question for Roger Rose and the staff at the temple. I can't speak on that, but I hope so.
And someone's asking again for the dates of the bus tour.
Oh, it's October 6th through the 15th. Send me an email if you're interested. I also forgot to mention that on that tour, we're going to stop off in Toronto to visit our friends at the Toronto Center Place and learn a little bit. I know those people. Yeah, they're great.
In fact, one of them's on with us tonight.
Wonderful. There's a lot of church history in Canada, and we're hoping to explore that, but also explore how our friends in the Toronto Center Place, drawn from the nations of the world, create sacred community and worship experiences with people literally from all over the world. So we're looking to the past on this bus tour, but also looking forward as a global family and community of Christ.
Barbara, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation tonight. I hope it was helpful for those who have joined us this evening and those who have joined us on the recording.